We have our next speaker coming up. He is the founder and CEO of Virtue and the author of Ethical Machines. Here comes Reid Blackman.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming. I'll try not to ruin the conference by leaving it on a bad note. I had made no promises about such a thing, though. I want to talk about what I call the AI Ethical Nightmare Challenge. So you've heard stuff about responsible AI. I'm not the responsible AI guy so much as I am the let's avoid the nightmares guy. So here's a very tiny case study, very tiny. Facebook was created in 2004, and it reached 100 million users in 4.5 years. Lightning fast, right? I mean, this is as much as Zuckerberg could have hoped for. It's amazing. Of course, there was some fallout as well. We saw the Cambridge Analytica scandal in 2015, genocide in Myanmar in 2016 that Facebook played some role in, and there's Facebook-owned Instagram, where there's known widespread depression and anxiety among teenage girls from using Instagram. Not ideal. I'm not saying there aren't great things about Facebook. There are, but as we all know, there are also some problems with it as well. What's the lesson, though? I don't really care about, I'm not going to beat up on Facebook, Meta. That's not the focus of this. The question is, what's the lesson that we should learn? And I think we all actually kind of know it, but it really needs to be made explicit. It's that new technologies bring new ethical nightmares. And this should make business leaders and society very nervous. It's not as though this is a one-off thing. All right, that was one technology or application of technology, social media, that led to those problems. But with the rest of the technologies, we don't have to worry. Well, of course we do. So we need to learn our lesson. So I want to talk about that. Because here's potentially a new case study on the horizon. And really, it's not, the horizon's quite close. OpenAI's ChatGPT, which was released, as you know, at the end of 2022, reached 100 million users in just 2 months. That's insane. I mean, we all know it's insane. 2 months, not 4 years, 2 months, with now, it has over 170 million plus. That figure, that 170 plus million, that's from April. It's bigger now. It's already being used in high-stakes scenarios. So you or a loved one may have already been to a doctor where behind the scenes they were using GPT 4.0 to engage in a diagnosis of you. It's happening now. They're not supposed to do it. They've been told, don't go to GPT 4.0 for diagnosing, but doctors are doing it today. And it's early, right? We just started. To be clear, a tremendous amount of amazing innovation to be done, great benefits, including in healthcare. But we have to be able to hold in our mind both the thought that we can do tremendously good things and we can, accidentally, do really horrible things. I'm going to try to convince you of 3 claims. The first is that I think that businesses need to identify these risks as ethical nightmares. I'll say more about this. The general view, though, is that businesses should say the word ethics. I think that they're standardly afraid to say it. And I think that businesses need to focus on the nightmares. Not the ethical ideal, not the goal, not sort of the platonic ideal of what it is to be a good, virtuous person or organization. That's lovely. It's also completely unrealistic. And it's not the top priority. Top priority is let's talk about ethics and let's focus on the nightmares that we want to avoid. That's the first claim that I want to convince you of. The second is that these nightmares are likely to happen, not just possible, but likely to happen because of how the technology works and because of the high-stakes purposes to which we put that technology. It's not just a mere possibility. We are right now not wondering, or we ought not to be wondering whether various kinds of ethical nightmares are going to get realized, but when they're going to happen, and at what scale, and who will be impacted. Last crucial thing, business leaders, not technologists, are ultimately responsible. And If you're a technologist who's also a leader, I'm talking to you in your capacity as a leader. This is not a technology problem, or at least it's not fundamentally or solely a technology problem. It's a leadership issue. It's a leadership issue. And business leaders, when they're doing well, will take these ethical nightmares seriously and will address them appropriately. So those are the 3 claims I'm going to want to convince you of. I'm going to try to convince you of over the course of the next 15-ish minutes. Let's focus on the first one. Business leaders need to identify these risks as ethical nightmares. But here's the thing. Businesses don't like saying the word ethics. In a previous life, I was a philosophy professor, an ethicist. I don't really like saying that because it sounds, I'm a philosopher sounds terrible, doesn't it? It just sounds way too self-aggrandizing. But I was a philosophy professor, and I went to this conference on sustainability. And I thought, I'm curious how corporate America thinks about the environment and their ethical responsibilities. I should, go learn something that would be interesting. But the weird thing is that no one at that conference was actually talking about the environment. Everyone was talking about raising people out of poverty and giving education to all, clean drinking water. And I thought this is a conference on sustainability. But they're just talking about ethical goals that they want to reach. And then they make this empirical claim that pursuing those ethical goals is good for the bottom line. And it struck me as weird to use the word sustainable when really what they mean is the word ethics. I mean, oppression has been sustained for a long time, right? We're actually really good at sustaining oppression and discrimination. Like it's actually what we're better at than the opposite of it. So I hear business leaders saying the word sustainable instead of saying the word ethics. That's corporate America. Wall Street, ESG. Maybe you've heard of environmental, social, and governance criteria for investment. It's just Wall Street's way of saying ethics without saying ethics. Just say ethics, it's going to be okay. How about human-centric design? Human-centric? Were we already designing for aardvarks? Why would we call this human-centric? It's clear that what people mean when they're talking about human-centric design, at least in part, is ethical design, ethically responsible design. Just say it. Value-driven, mission-driven, purpose-driven. More ways to contort yourself semantically not to say the word ethics. And many missions, values, purposes, they're completely amoral, for lack of a better word. They're ethically neutral. If you say your value is customer-obsessed, great, that could be a nice value, but it's an economic value, not an ethical value. You're customer-obsessed because you think then you'll sell them more stuff so you'll make more money. That's great. Go do that. You're a business. But don't pretend that that's an ethical value. It's a straightforward economic value. People talk about culture and inclusion and being equitable. These are at best subsets of what constitutes an ethically sound organization. And now for my personal favorite one. Everyone started clamoring for AI ethics. People are talking about AI ethics, AI ethics. It's been growing over the many years. And corporate America heard the call. And then they said, we too are for responsible AI. I said ethics. Why did you say responsible AI? Why are you translating it? It's very weird to me. We should be able to name our problem. It's an ethical problem. The fallout from Facebook were ethical fallouts, not responsible fallouts, or if so, the responsibility is downstream of the ethical problem. So everyone says, let's do AI ethics. And then what happens in practice is that people start talking about responsible AI. Now, I'm going to tell you why I don't like the phrase responsible AI. You can use it. It's okay. I mean, look, words are tools, and if they can get the job done, then use those words because they're getting the job done. But in fact, in practice, that's not what happens. What I've seen many times with many organizations is that they throw too many things into the responsible AI bucket. And there's a big focus on all the non-ethicsy stuff, and the ethicsy stuff gets left behind. So you say, we're for responsible AI. That means we are for, and then you get cybersecurity, engineering excellence, like model robustness, regulatory and legal compliance, and then you say transparency and accountability, because you're supposed to say that too, and then you throw in bias maybe, and then that's sort of it. All the ethicsy stuff, the core of the ethical nightmares that we wanted to address when people were talking about AI ethics gets left behind through a kind of semantic legerdemain. We lost the ethics, so we put in responsible AI instead. And so this has the practical effect. Not in principle, again, it's fine. Words are tools, and if they get the job done, that's fine. But if the tools you use actually change your behavior, then that's not great, because you're going to not achieve the goal that you were aiming for. And then when it does come to what is in the responsible AI bucket, it's these vague terms: transparency, fairness, explainability. But no one's transparent with everyone about everything. Not every model needs to be explainable. You can have black box models that are perfectly legitimate to use, at least from an ethical perspective. And what constitutes being fair varies wildly by use case. And so the idea that you could just sort of slap in these ethical words into your responsible AI statement, and then in practice focus on the things that actually make sense that you can properly operationalize, like making sure that your models are robust. What happens as just a matter of fact, contingent empirical fact, is that the ethical stuff floats away, and the ethical nightmares are just as probable as they were before you implemented your responsible AI program. And there's no clear picture of what failure looks like. We're for responsible AI. Well, what constitutes irresponsible AI? What's failure by the lights of our responsible AI program? Again, we can say we're for transparency and accountability, but no one's going to be transparent with everyone about everything. So when is withholding information a failure of our responsible AI program, and when is it actually just the right thing to do, ethically otherwise? So here's why I like talking about ethical nightmares instead. It calls the problem by its name. If you can't name your problem accurately, you're not going to be able to address it effectively. And the problem, the number one problem, is ethical nightmares. And nightmares are vivid and specific. If I tell you, hey, give me 5 or 6 ethical nightmares for your organization, I bet you could do it. I bet you could be pretty specific. One of the problems that people have with talking about ethics, saying the word ethics, and why they contort themselves in all these ways, sustainability, human-centric, value-driven, mission-driven, they don't know what to do with ethics because it feels squishy and subjective and opinion-y and touchy-feely, not concrete, not measurable. Nightmares are not like that, though. Maybe the Platonic ideal of what constitutes a unique, a perfectly just institution, that's really hard to get your hands around. But you can get your hands around ethical nightmares. They're specific. They're vivid. And relatedly, you get a very clear picture of what failure looks like. We have failed in addressing the ethical nightmares of our technologies because our nightmares have become real. We discriminated against 100,000 people with our latest HR software. We violated the privacy of every one of our users, 50% of our users, whatever it is. You know what your ethical nightmares look like. You can then know what failure looks like. So that's why I want people to talk in the language of not just AI ethics in particular, as opposed to sustainability and human-centric and all that. Alignment is another big one lately. Aligning with human interests, which is a euphemistic way of saying hoping that AI doesn't destroy us all, because that would be an ethical nightmare. Just say it would be an ethical nightmare. OK, let's go to the next claim. AI ethical nightmares are likely, not merely possible, but likely because of how the technology works and the high-stakes purposes to which we put it. Think about what machine learning is. It identifies patterns that are too complex to understand. If we're talking about deep neural networks, the whole point is that it can gather insights from a phenomenally complex data set. To see patterns that we can't see. If we could see those patterns ourselves, we wouldn't need it. So it sees these phenomenally complex patterns. They're too complex for mere mortals to understand. And so we get a high likelihood that we're going to have black box models, and probably deployed in places in which a black box model is not appropriate. And again, I do think there are cases in which they are appropriate, just not all the time. Because machine learning is in the business of identifying patterns in data, those patterns may well be discriminatory in various ways, and then you get the problem of discriminatory AI. Notice, to take a sort of a contrast, think about blockchain technology. You don't need to know a lot about it, but blockchain technology is not in the business of recognizing complex patterns in data. That's just not what that technology is about. And so you're not going to get, in the same kind of way, likely discriminatory patterns being identified. But because ML is in the business of, it's the nature of the beast to identify patterns, that patterns are often about people, and data about how people have behaved historically over hundreds, thousands of years, you're going to very likely get discriminatory patterns in the data that are then recreated and scaled by your AI. It's the nature of the beast to be a pattern recognizer, including a biased pattern recognizer. And because the fuel of machine learning is data, often data about people, your organization is highly incentivized to collect as much data about as many people as you can, because all else equal, you'll get a more accurate AI, all else equal. And so, insofar as you want to get as much fuel as you can, so you can go as far as you can with AI, you're thereby incentivized to violate people's privacy by virtue of collecting, using data that you ought not to have. Relatedly, machine learning is in the business of making, if you like, inferences. So there's, of course, the training data, and then there's the inferred data, the data that you wind up with, the outputs. It might be the case that it's okay for you from a privacy perspective to have that training data, but you may infer things about people. The possession of that knowledge constitutes a violation of their privacy. So if you're making predictions or you're trying to come to have new knowledge about people, you're likely to, in some cases, violate their privacy. With large language models, we're going to have hallucinations. These are not knowledge models, they're language models. They don't track truth. They're just trying to come up with a set of words that are coherent. But you could have perfect coherence and a complete disconnect from reality. Right? We probably all know some people who have bizarre views that are internally consistent, but they don't seem to really touch reality in any way. That's what LLMs are. So it's highly likely that you're going to get hallucinations because the thing has no, if you like, respect for truth. That's not what it's in the business of doing. So all of those were likely by virtue of how the technology works. But then we have all these use case specific risks, one of which I've already talked about, diagnoses and prescriptions in healthcare and life sciences, risk ratings in financial services, insurance, and criminal justice, and more, unjustified arrests in military applications, surveillance technologies, inadequate communication to relevant stakeholders. Right? You data scientists may have a really good grip on how the thing works, and so you know what the ethical deployment of it looks like, but if there's not sufficient communication with the end user, the right kind of training, now you get ethical nightmares. And then there's high-risk deployment by distracted, tired, undertrained, and frankly, in some cases, underbrained personnel. Okay. We did the first two. Now I want to convince you that this is primarily a leadership problem and not primarily a technology problem. There are a number of qualitative, ethical, reputational, regulatory, and legal decisions that need to be made. And frankly, data scientists are standardly not the ones in their capacity as data scientists, as opposed to leaders, the best ones to make those kinds of judgments. So for instance, what's the appropriate benchmark for safe deployment? What's the appropriate benchmark for using an LLM in a diagnostic setting? Data scientists are standardly not the ones who need to make that kind of judgment, who need to say, we've done enough of our due diligence of this LLM in all these contexts with enough people with different variety of backgrounds, race, gender, ethnicity, to know that it's safe to use LLMs for consultation, for diagnosing. That's a big decision, very big decision to make. You might want to ask if your chatbot is objectionably manipulative. There will be ways of training LLMs to be the best negotiator, the best salesperson, the best at stoking fears to manipulate people, to buy things they don't want. One day it's, sneakers, the next day it's a conspiracy theory. But on the other hand, there's reasonable incentives that your chatbot might offer. We'll give you $10 if you sign up now, or something along those lines. So there's a line between what constitutes reasonable incentive and manipulation and undermining people's autonomy, ability to decide freely. And there needs to be a really tough decision made, usually on a use case basis, about are we being objectionably manipulative or are we providing reasonable incentives? Is it appropriate to defer to the AI's judgment? What's the appropriate metric for bias? Some of you are probably familiar with the various metrics for evaluating whether the ways in which you've distributed your goods or services are done in a fair, just, equitable way, but those metrics are incompatible with each other, and so you're left over with this really substantive, ethical, reputational decision. What's the appropriate metric for bias in this particular use case? What constitutes a good explanation? I'll just run through a few more of these things. Who should have control over the data? Should it be your organization? Should it be your user? Is this content appropriate for the audience? Is this our responsibility, or the vendors, or the users, or the governments? These are tough questions, but they're crucial for deploying AI in a way that's not likely to come into ethical nightmares. Crucially, you cannot math your way out of these questions. It's qualitative decisions that leaders need to make, informed by relevant subject matter experts, but it's a problem for leadership to handle, because not in your capacity as a technologist, but as in your capacity as a leader, as a wise, informed leader, do you make these kinds of decisions. Okay, so then the question is, well, then what should leaders do? There's lots to say here. I don't have time to say all the things. I'll say some of the things. Take the AI ethical nightmare challenge. It's very simple at a high level. At a high level, how do we operationalize ethics? How do we operationalize ethical risk mitigation is relatively straightforward. Step one, first define your organization's ethical nightmares. You can do that, get a cross-functional team in there, have a number of conversations, workshops, et cetera, but you can define your organization's ethical nightmares. I bet you can. I know that you can. And then put controls in place to stop them from happening. You can do that too. Not hard. So all these claims, oh, ethics, it's so subjective, it's squishy, you can't operationalize it. How do you operationalize fairness? How do you operationalize Tell me what your ethical nightmares are. Tell me what controls you're putting in place to stop them from happening. Relatively simple. Now, on the ground, does it get more complicated? Of course. But at a high level, we can't say we don't know how to put ethics into practice. Here's two approaches that I'll just talk about very quickly. These are the informal approach and the quick and dirty approach. The informal, quick, and dirty approach, and the more formal one. In the informal one, which frankly is the mode that many organizations are in right now because generative AI just came to their doorstep, all of a sudden, even if there are not a bunch of fires breaking out throughout the organization, as one client put it, everyone now has a flamethrower. And we got to do something. We've got to do something. We have to make sure that we at least keep an inventory of who's using it. Maybe we give them the ability to smell ethical smoke, so to speak, checklist criteria for high risk, something along those lines, and give them a means by which to consult the relevant advisory board. It's quick, it's dirty. You give them some education that's built around ethical nightmare identification, create an advisory board that they know they can go to. It's not systematic, it's not comprehensive. Things could fall between the cracks, land on the front page, but it's something. Because the more formal approach is slower. It should be done, but that informal approach is, if you like, an entree to the more formal approach, which is systematic and top-down. Now you're talking about a clear articulation of what your standards look like, designing a customized framework, metrics and KPIs for your ethical risk program, and yes, you can have metrics and KPIs for ethics. But at least starting with that informal approach gets you somewhere. The big takeaway here is that as leaders in AI, it's on you to protect your organization, your customers, and society at large. It's not going to be government anytime soon. Bit slow on the regulations, bit behind. It's going to be on you as leaders to stop the ethical nightmares from happening. Thanks so much. Q&A or? Well, me. Want to do some Q&A? Anyone have any questions? I mean, we're all friends here. We've got time. Everyone's going home. Yeah.
I find it interesting with the idea that we call a GPT a hallucination when it does not reflect reality.
Yeah.
It's implying that we're anthropomorphizing it.
Yeah.
We're giving it a humanness. So how does that idea or concept of anthropomorphizing it impact the ethics around it? And it's a very broad question I'm asking,
sure.
But yeah.
And by virtue of it being broad, there's a sort of it's complicated is going to be the short answer. Look, anthropomorphizing it could be good in some cases. I mean, there's a way in which if you call the outputs of a model decisions, as lots of people tend to do, that might help you conceptualize that we need to think about whether we're making an ethically sound or an ethically responsible decision. So insofar as that language helps some people wrap their heads around how this is not a math problem, it's a different kind of problem, it's good. Insofar as it imputes a level of responsibility to the model as opposed to the people who developed the model, who trained it, who tested and validated it, who are monitoring it, then it's bad. So like many other things, there's going to be good and bad to anthropomorphizing your model. I generally try to stay away from it as much as I can, but it's very difficult to not. I mean, you just find yourself doing this all the time. It's making judgments. It decided instead of it has its outputs. So I don't know, does that answer your question? You can say no, it's fine. Okay. What else? Yeah. I can hear you, and a microphone is running to you. I don't mean to anthropomorphize the microphone, but
So, flames. There's a phrase like, don't think of an elephant, which is basically like a suggestion that once an idea is planted, it's very hard for people to like avoid focusing on that as opposed to the opposite. So if there's a lot of focus on thinking about the nightmare scenarios, how do you think that might or might not like distract from thinking about the more ideal scenario that we would wish for?
yeah, no. So my approach is not uncontroversial in the sort of in the academic sense in which meaning people disagree with me, not that it's a big controversy on the front page. Yeah, I have some colleagues who think no, we should talk about the good. We should strive towards the good, not the, as I like to say it, not the not bad. We should strive towards the good, and if we fall short of it, then at least we'll be better than where we were before, and we will also thereby avoid the bad. In principle, that's fine. In practice, I think it just doesn't work. Because in practice, there's a number of issues. Number one, try getting executive alignment about what constitutes the ethical good of the organization. Very difficult to get. And it is a little bit squishy, is not quite the right word, but there's going to be lots of reasonable disagreement about what constitutes that ethical ideal. It is also a massive lift. I mean, going from 0 to 100 is a massive lift, and organizations have limited resources. So I think that when organizations are tasked with being, if you like, striving for the ethical good, they just don't do anything because it's too big. It's too much of a project. It's too big of a lift. It requires too much training, too much dedication of resources. We've got other priorities. So it's like, just don't violate people's human rights. Okay, we can do that. We can do that. So that's why I think it's, again, in principle, yeah, strive for the good. And look, ideally you have a phased approach to ethical risk mitigation where, phase one, which let's say that's year one, just for sake of argument, is let's avoid the ethical nightmares. That's your first step. And then, okay, let's go to the next. Let's try to mitigate the rest as well. So for instance, one of my clients, year one is just let's identify and mitigate high risk as defined by the EU AI Act. That's it. That's all we can handle. But year two, we're going to go to that lower level of risk identification by the Act. So it's not high risk, I forgot what they call it, but it's medium risk. And the Act is officially cool with that. You can do whatever you want with medium risk. But this organization is saying, we want to get to the point at which we're also systematically identifying and mitigating those medium risks as well. And then year three is, so on and so forth. So I think a phased approach is the best way to do it from a pragmatic perspective. Last question. There's someone back there, yes.
Yeah, thank you.
Although I'll be available over here after.
Do you think Congress should regulate AI?
Yeah. Next question. No, kidding. Yeah, look, they do. I'm trying to think about how specific I should get here. But I think that in the race to not be left behind, the fear of missing out is causing a lot of companies to do things not on the ethical up and up. It worries me, for instance, that LLMs are available in healthcare. One might think that the companies that are responsible for that rushed it. And the reason that they rushed deployment is because they wanted to be first to market. They wanted to make the biggest splash. Right? Google went on red alert because, oh my God, we're so behind. That's because the rules of the game, the rules of the economic market, are such that first to market wins, doesn't matter, just go, go, go. But if the rules of the game were different, then you wouldn't have that kind of rushing. So if there were regulations in place that prohibited the deployment of tools that may be used by virtually anyone in high-risk cases, then we wouldn't run into that. So I do think that we need regulation. Yeah. That said, I think there's lots of ways to go wrong with regulation that's unnecessarily stifle innovation. So for instance, and I referenced this during the talk, you can have, people are afraid of black box models, but I actually think that there are lots of cases in which a black box model is totally acceptable. What if I have a black box model that I've tested like crazy, and it's less biased than all the other, everything else we can compare it to, it's more accurate. Let's go with that. If I can have a cancer diagnosing AI that's 99% accurate, and the best doctor is 75% accurate, and you ask me which one do I want to diagnose my kid, I'm probably going to go with the thing that is 99% accurate. But if regulations are done in a sort of ham-handed way, then you get, oh, black boxes are no good, they're unacceptable, they're scary, but that can actually stifle progress. So yes, I'm for regulation, but I think that there needs to be a much more subtle approach than I've seen so far. I'll be around. Thanks so much, everyone.